Hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you. This week's material is around the gastrointestinal system, the function, the structure, the function, the dysfunction, and it will be an interesting subject. We start off with uh, talking about the functions of the digestive system. So there is a ton of functions for the digestive system, from producing enzymes and hormones to storage of and synthesis of vitamins, and we'll see how that to breaking down food and synthesizing uh, building blocks from that food and how the food is digested and absorbed and how it's eliminated for that matter. So we'll cover not anatomy. I'm not going to go over anatomy because you took the course of anatomy physiology, but we'll talk about those as we're talking about the function. So we'll cover the structure as we're talking about the function because we need to brush up on those before we talk about the pathophysiology. And we're going to be talking about the nitty-gritty things that are within the function of the digestive system and each part of it, because only then we can understand and appreciate the dysfunction and how the manifestations of the dysfunction are going to be seen and some of the treatment for that. So we've said that the GI system is where food is broken down, nutrients are absorbed, and then wastes are collected and eliminated. But you can appreciate that GI system is now being recognized as an endocrine organ because there's some hormones that are produced in there, and they regulate appetite. They regulate how we intake food. For example, gastrin, cholecystokinin, and secretins. We're going to talk about those uh, respectively when we talk about endocrine part of the GI system. And the intestine is divided in kind of like three zones where you talk about the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine or the bowel, and there where the bowel movement comes from. It's because that last part of the intestine is called the bowel, and then. The liver and pancreas are included in the GI system coverage because of their role as accessory organ for the GI system. So let's talk about the parts of the GI system. As we talked about earlier, the physiological function of the GI system is to digest food, absorb nutrients, and the way it does that is by motility, secretion, digestion, and absorption. And really it goes in chronological order or in a systemic way where the food is going to enter from the mouth, and that's we're talking normal, not the patient is sick and they have an nasogastric tube or some other way of feeding. We're talking that uh, we get the food and they move slowly through the length of the GI system up to where it becomes a waste and we eliminate it. And then there's something that we talk about enteral, and that's the part of the digestive system. So enteral within versus intravenous, and that's in the IV. And the food comes really and stays in the GI system until and unless it is absorbed, it doesn't go in the food, and thus the byproduct of food. We're talking about amino acid, fatty acid, vitamins, minerals. So once they're absorbed, then they become part of they go into the blood and end up in being nutritious. And that's when we talk about nutrition. And the last chapter we're going to talk about in this series is nutrition. So starting from the upper part of the GI, the mouth is the entryway for that food and goes without saying that without teeth, we're not going to be able to do that mastication of food. And without the tongue, we can't move the food around. And so then it moves towards the pharyngeal area and then goes through the esophagus But also the mouth, with that saliva, it moistens the food, it lubricates the food, and helps in swallowing. And then also you will find out that in the mouth there's some digestion, initial digestion of lipids and starches. And then you move through the esophagus. It's really like a straight tube, about a 10-inch in length, and it sits behind the trachea. So we covered the respiratory last week, or 2 weeks ago. So it sits right behind the trachea, and you have the oropharynx connection with the stomach. And then, so what is the role of esophagus? Is primarily it's a conduit for the food, and it's kind of like has like three portions. The first upper portion of it is purely skeletal muscle, and then the middle one is kind of mixed, and then the last part is pure um, um, smooth muscle, because the rest of the GI system is mostly smooth muscle. And then so you have two sphincters with the esophagus. One is at um, the upper esophageal sphincter and the lower esophageal sphincter. The upper one, or the pharyngoesophageal sphincter, is that circular layer of striated muscle that keeps air from entering into the esophagus and into the stomach when we breathe. The lower one, the gastroesophageal sphincter, is right there at the joint with the stomach. And the main role of that is from preventing the acid from the stomach to go back into the esophagus. And the stomach moves in a repulsive propulsion manner, where content goes into the stomach. There's no digestion in there, it's just a passageway. Then we go to the stomach, and in the stomach, the stomach is a pouch-like. If you remember from anatomy physiology, it sits right there starts in the left side and goes down in the abdomen, and you'll see how it could be heartburn can be mixed with some gastritis symptoms, because they're very anatomically close. What happens is the esophagus opens into the stomach. That cardiac orifice, or that lower esophageal sphincter, and then the food goes down into the stomach. And it kind of just serves as a food storage in the beginning of the digestion. And then the food has to move down after we talk about the digestion of the food. The food moves down to the duodenum, where most of the real digestion and absorption start happening in the small intestine. And it has to go through that pyloric sphincter. And that pyloric sphincter is the sphincter between the stomach and the duodenum. And let me tell you one thing. So the pyloric is at the antrum. So the beginning of the stomach is a fundus, then you have the body, and then you have the antrum that connects with the duodenum. And there's that sphincter, the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is a real sphincter. So it opens and closes. You'll see some food stays in the stomach for 2 hours before it's allowed to enter into the duodenum, versus the lower esophageal sphincter we talked about. And we're going to talk about GERD and how the food goes back with GERD, because that sphincter really is not a real sphincter. It's kind of a fake. It's an imposter. We'll talk about it more in GERD when we talk about dysfunction. But really, the pyloric sphincter acts as a valve. It controls how much and when the stomach empties into the intestine. And we'll talk about this because we want to remember that the stomach is acidic, very acidic. And so it can't really just push things into the duodenum before the duodenum is ready to take that food and neutralize it. And then you go into that small intestine. So we talked to you, I already told you there's that duodenum. So the duodenum is the first part that meets with the stomach, followed by the jejunum, and the ileum is the end of the small intestine. Again, the duodenum is small, short. It's like 10 inches, and but it plays a major role. At the tip of the duodenum, there is the opening from the common bile duct and the main pancreatic duct, and those bile and pancreatic juices enter into the intestine through those ducts. And so the food is starts to be really digested there and starts to be absorbed a little bit in the duodenum, but more into the duodenum and the ileum. Ileum is the one where most of your nutritious values are absorbed. Your vitamins, your minerals are absorbed there. Combined all together, the jejunum and the ileum with the duodenum are like 9 feet long. And then we end up with the lower GI tract, and here you have, they call the large intestine as opposed to the small intestine. And it is like a 1.5 meter for around 5 feet long. The first part of it, you have the cecum, then the colon, then the rectum, and then the anal canal. The colon, there's like 3 parts of it. You have the ascending column, the transverse column, and the descending and the sigmoid portion. It's like S shape. We're gonna talk about the dysfunction as we move along here. Just you know, the functions of it. Before we talk about the functions, I want to remind you that in the cecum you have the appendix. It's like a 1 inch in size in the ileocecal valve, and really that's how you're going to be having to remember that appendicitis, because you're going to see it a ton. And then at the rectum, the rectum is the extension of that sigmoid column, and then you have the anus. And in the anus, you have the anal canal where you have those sphincter muscles that guard the fecal matter from going out, you know, just like whenever it wants. So it prohibits us from having that fecal incontinence. In figure 36.3 in your book, you have the gastrointestinal wall structure, and it shows you the 4-layered structure of the GI system and how it is like a tube, and you have those villi inside. So let's take a look at them. The first layer in the GI, which is the most inner mucosal layer, the first layer is made up of a lining of epithelium. And underlying connective tissue is called the lamina propria under it, and here is where you're going to see that production of the mucus that lubricates and protects the inner surface of the whole GI tract. The secretion of those digestive enzymes are going to happen there. The absorption of and the breakdown of the byproducts of digestion is going to happen there. The maintenance of a barrier is going to happen there. So and these epithelial cells seem like your skin cell. Your skin cells are epithelial cells. They have that turnover, and they keep on restructuring almost every 5 days. Then you have the second layer, and in that second layer, the submucosal layer, you have that dense connective tissue, and you have some adipose tissue also there. This is where you're going to have the blood, the nerves, that structure that are responsible for secreting some of those also digestive enzymes. And then the third layer is the muscularis muscularis externa, and this is the inner layer of circularly arranged smooth muscles. I told you the GI is mostly smooth muscles, and this is really what facilitates that movement of contents in the GI tract, that peristaltic movement. The fourth layer is a serous membrane. It's called the mesothelium, and it is just a squamous epithelium cells, and there's also connective tissue in there, and in the encasing the GI is that peritoneum, and it really acts same like we were talking about when you covered the cardiac, how you have the pericardium sac that covers and protects the heart, and we talked about pleural space embracing and protecting the lungs. And here the peritoneum is it encloses all the abdominal viscera, and it keeps it in place. And you'll have inside that you have everything, the contents of the intestine, in addition to the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels and the nerves. In addition, you hear the talk about the omentum, which is a double layer. You hear the greater omentum, the lesser omentum, and because sometimes when they open a patient that has any cancer in the abdominal cavity, and they say, "Oh, it reached the omentum," and that means it's metastatic. It bypass all the layers. But really, those omentums are meant to help with the cushioning against injuries. We'll talk about what injuries can happen and how vulnerable the GI system is. So how does the GI contents move? So that is a very essential part. Also, we're going to talk about movement and what happens if the movement stops. And we'll talk about the word ileus and where there is no motility in the GI tract. Why the GI tract moves is to move that food and flowing the fluids from the entrance to the end, and the goal is to facilitate digestion and absorption, digestion of the food and absorption of those nutritious value that we get from the food. And there's two types of movement, either tonic or rhythmic. The rhythmic movements are those intermittent contractions that move in a way so that they can mix the food and move them along. Whereas the and you find those more in the esophagus and in the stomach, a little bit in the small intestine. The tonic movement are constant level of contraction without regular periods of relaxation, and that you will find in the some part of the esophagus, in also in the stomach, but mostly in the valves and anal sphincters. In the nervous system, as I told you beginning, it's more striated muscles, and as you move down the lower part of the esophagus, you're going to see more smooth muscles. And so the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of it, have a direct role in that GI motility. And then you have the enteric nervous system, which consists of the myenteric and the submucosal plexus, and they're kind of nerve fibers, ganglion cell bodies that is mostly concerned with controlling the secretion, absorption, and contraction of each section of the intestinal tract. As you remember, we start off with food in the mouth. That mastication is going to break down the food, and then the bolus of food is pushed by the tongue to the back, and that's kind of the oral phase. Once it hits the pharynx, it's in the pharyngeal phase. And what you need to remember here is that if there's anything with alteration in swallowing, and then that respiration inhibition in the pharyngeal phase may be disrupted, and then the food can go in the wrong pipe. So that's one thing to highlight when we're talking about how what is it that we care about, why we're dividing all these stages. In the esophageal phase, that's when the esophagus starts to initiate that peristalsis to trigger the food to go into the stomach. So we have to really connect swallowing and defecation with all the rest of the um, GI tract, and that's in the fact that it is that motility. And that motility is, like we said, to move the food from the stage of digestion or eating to digestion to absorption and then propulsion of any waste or undigested material. And that peristaltic movement mixes the ingested foodstuff with digestive enzymes and secretions, and facilitate the contact of the food with the intestinal mucosa so that the blood can absorb the nutrients. And that regulation of motility. There is an interplay between the autonomic nervous system and the enteric nerves that we talked about earlier. And then, so the act of defecation is not as autonomic as we see it as we go down to the smooth muscles of the gastric and the stomach and to the small intestine. And when we get to the and even in the column in the large intestine, we have the same peristaltic movement and autonomic or voluntary movement. But what the act of defecation is a controlled action, and there's two sphincters. There's the internal, external, inner sphincters, and they do control and they're more of a striated muscles than smooth muscles, and that is um, a good thing because, as we said, otherwise the patient would be incontinent. Throughout the GI tract, you're going to see secretory glands, and they basically either produce mucus to lubricate and protect the layers of the GI tract, or they're secreting fluids, enzymes to help with the digestion, absorption of nutrients. And so literally, there's like 7 liters of fluid that's secreted in the GI tract. Around 100 to 200 of this goes with the stool. The remainder is reabsorbed and recycled in the small intestine and large intestine. These secretions have the water, sodium, potassium. Um, and they're similar in constitution from with the extracellular fluid, and you usually don't want to discard those secretions. So you'll find if you put a nasogastric tube in the patient, you want to save them because they have juice and stomach juice and electrolytes. And you have table 36.2 that itemizes the fluids and how much daily is secreted from each system. When you talk about the secretory digestive function of the guts, you first talk about the saliva, which is takes its name from the glands, the salivary glands that produce it, and you have that parotid gland, that submaxillary gland, sublingual glands, and the buccal gland. So there are 4 types. They have 3 functions: to protect and lubricate, and saliva is rich in mucus, and that is it coats the food as it passes through the mouth, through the pharynx, and through the esophagus. And then you have those mucus type secretions that are produced by the sublingual buccal glands. And another one is the protective antimicrobial action of the saliva. It cleans the mouth. It has the enzyme lysozyme, which has an antibacterial action. The last function of the saliva is that it has that ptyalin and the amylase, and that's why we say that the starch's digestion starts in the mouth with the saliva. And moving to moving to the GI system secretions. So we talked about the salivary secretions. We're talking now about the gastric secretions. Mucus secreting epithelial cells line the surface of the stomach, and they also again act as a protective barrier for the surface of the stomach. You have to appreciate the stomach has the acidic secretions, hydrochloric acid that are secreted, and that helps with chiming the food and break it down. And but that acid is really acidic. It's like 4 on the scale of acidity, on average 5-ish, but that's very acidic. And then if you remember biochemistry, that type of acidity is going to break down the proteins. Correct. So what you want to do is let the acid eat the food and like does its action on the food, but protect those lining of the stomach because they're proteinish, so they're gonna be broken down. So you want to prevent the stomach from digesting itself, and that's the role of the mucus that's secreted by the stomach. And so there is more than one type of um, cells. We have the parietal cells, and we have the chief cells, and we have the G cells. And the parietal and chief cells are almost in the body and the fundus, and there's like 1 billion parietal cells in the stomach, and these are responsible for secreting hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. Remember the intrinsic factor from the hematology lecture? That was the one factor that is needed for the absorption of vitamin B12, and that's it, here it is. It is secreted by those parietal cells in the stomach, along with hydrochloric acid. And the gastric acid is really a chemical agent that helps in the breakdown as well as in the disinfection. That's why we don't get sick with those food that are badly handled. Otherwise, we would be sick all the time. But it doesn't really get to us unless if it's really, really contaminated with very vicious bugs, virulent ones. So then you have the chief cells. Those chief cells, they secrete the pepsinogen, and pepsinogen will become pepsin when it meets the hydrochloric acid. And then pepsin is an enzyme that will cause proteolysis. And when we talk about proteolysis, you're talking about breaking down of proteins. So again, you're talking about the stomach eating itself. And that's why they are timed and they are regulated. So they come in a very rhythmic way where everything is kosher until something abnormality happens in there. After the stomach, we have the intestine. So in the small intestine, we have so many digestive juices that are secreted, and as well as the small intestine gets secretions from the liver, from the pancreas. So you have so many glands within the intestine that are producing for those enzymes, and you see that the secretions from the pancreas enter the duodenum with for example, alkaline material that's going to balance the gastric content that has just been dumped into the duodenum. Um, what else we want to talk here? Also, we have to um, know that the intestinal uh, lining it has villi, so it's kind of like wavy lining, and then in the villi there's microvilli, and then each one, so if you spread it, it's going to be too long. Remember how long we said um, the uh, between the jejunum and the ileum, but if you spread the villi and the microvilli, it's going to be a very long system. But what we want to remember here is that these are every one of them has a dedicated job to do and to secrete exactly whatever it is needed to digest. Then you have another element in the intestine, and these are the flora. And then we talk about the normal flora on the skin. We talked about it. Remember how those bacteria that grows on our head are healthy for us, good. Also in the gut, they are the natural habitat there, and they have multiple types of bacteria. And what they do is they salvage energy, they help with absorption of nutrients, and they can also protect from colonization by bad bacteria, pathogenic bacteria. So they live anywhere from the stomach down to the intestine. So you have in the stomach you have only a few species, whereas the large intestine has around 300 to 500 different species of bacteria. So in your book, there is a table 36.1 that has those selected gastrointestinal hormones and their actions, starting from the cholecystokinin, how it's produced in the duodenum and jejunum, and what's it is produced for the contraction of gallbladder, secretion of pancreatic enzyme. They talk about the gastrin and how it's produced by the antrum of the stomach, and how it stimulates secretion of gastric acid and pepsinogen. And then they talk about secretin. So you can review those in there in brief, or read more about them when we talk about the gastrointestinal hormones. Okay, fact check. Is the following statement true or false? GI hormones function in the digestive tract to facilitate the absorption of essential nutrients. And the correct answer is nope. Those hormones stimulate a gland that will directly secrete enzymes into the digestive tract. Okay, moving on. In order for the food to be digested, you will see there is the hydrolysis process where the bigger chunks are divided down with the help of that water. You remember there's like 7 liters of water that is produced, or juices that are produced. Then you have those enzyme cleavage. You remember how we talked about pepsinogen broken down to pepsin with the hydrochloric acid. The fat emulsification happens with the bile production. The parietal cells producing gastric acid and producing intrinsic factor. We talk about the chief cells. The liver produces the bile and stores it in the gallbladder. Then you have those pancreatic enzymes. You have the trypsin, the chymotrypsin, the carboxypeptidase, and the elastase that are also essential for the breakdown of all those major food from carbohydrates to proteins to fats. And then you have specific enzymes, because we talked about enzyme cleavages, and every enzyme will work specifically on a specific food elements. For example, carbohydrates need to be broken down into monosaccharides or single sugars, and before so that they can be absorbed. But to be absorbed, they need those types of um, um, enzymes that break them. So amylase, secreted by the pancreas, will break down starch into disaccharides, like for maltose, isomaltose. You heard about those. Versus the brush border enzyme, which converts disaccharides into monosaccharides that can be absorbed. So you can appreciate how every enzyme is produced to help with that digestion. Um, and we talked about the gastric acid and the pepsin production, and we talked about how the parietal cells produce the hydrochloric acid and how the chief cells produce pepsinogen, and then it needs the hydrochloric acid to convert into pepsin. And the small intestine, we talked about how it has these villi, and each villi has arteries, veins, and lymph nodes, and these villi have microvilli, and the brush border enzymes are sitting on the border of the villi. They help with the digestion of the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and versus the mucus cells that are there for the protection mostly. Um, we talked about this, and I told you that mucosal mucin that is produced for the protection of the stomach, not only to protect it from the acidity of the hydrochloric acid, but also from pepsin acting as a proteolytic and eating the stomach away. What happens in the small intestine? We talked about the small intestine and how we see those all digestive juices coming from the liver and the pancreas, as well as the juices that come from mucus-producing glands, for example, the Brunner glands. And it, the Brunner gland is affected by autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic stimulation causes a decrease in mucus production versus the other way around. The intestinal mucosa not only produces the mucus, it also produces two types of secretions: serous fluid, and these are produced by the crypts of Leiberkhan, which are specialized cells, and it is like they produce like 2 liters a day, and they help with the absorption. The other type of secretions are surface enzymes that help with those absorption. The peptidases and the enzymes that help with the disaccharide and the amino acid absorption, and um, they the last part of the GI would be the large intestine. So, in large intestine, the only things that are produced are mucus, and here the effect of autonomic nervous system in the bowels is significant. But and so the parasympathetic stimulation may increase, and you'll see the stool have large amounts of mucus, but usually the bowels do not secrete any water or electron, but it controls their absorption. And so um, and we talked about the gut flora in a previous slide. So is this a true statement or a false statement? Again, check with you to see what do we know about the bacteria in the GI tract. Do they have a role? Yes, they are essential component of the digestive system. Great. Okay, what is digestion and absorption? We've been talking about it, and so we talked about how it's the dismantling of the food, and um, after that dismantling, that needed all those enzymes and all the secretions, we get to the absorption, and that's where the nutrients are moved from the hollow place inside the GI into the uh, internal environment of us and inside the blood. So it is really happens by two processes, active transport and diffusion. The absorption function of the large intestine really focuses mainly on water absorption. Um, but uh, other parts, for example, they have specified action. So we'll see the active transport in the case of the intrinsic factor. It needs to sit on vitamin B12 needs to sit on an intrinsic factor combined with it, and it travels with it into so that it can be absorbed. And so you see the difference in the absorption based on the anatomical structure. For example, in the GI system, you have in the small intestine, we saw that you have the villi and the microvilli, a ton of them. So you have a huge space for the absorption. Um, so we highlighted that the food is either digested by diffusion or by um, active transport. And we talked about this brush border enzymes. We talked about them. Let's talk about how carbohydrates are digested. And so you know that there'll be complex carbohydrates. We want to bring them to a simple, so you need to bring them down to monosaccharides, single sugars, and then they can be absorbed from the small intestine. And we know how much we like carbohydrates, and you have to think of them. What is the bottom line? Sucrose, that's your table sugar. Lactose, that's the sugar from the milk. So these are some of your sugars that you're trying to digest. Also, digestion of starch begins in the mouth with the action of the amylase, and then the pancreatic enzymes come and help in breaking down the starch into disaccharides, so maltose and isomaltose. And we talked about the brush border enzymes being able to break down the disaccharides also. Fat is also another huge ingredient in our meals and average American diet. And the first step in the digestion of lipid is to break that large globule into smaller sizes. And so, water-soluble digestive enzymes act on the surface of the molecule, and that's called emulsification. It begins in the stomach and then continues through the duodenum with the help of the bile that is produced by the liver. And then when you do, what you see in emulsification is that the number of triglyceride molecules increase, and then they get exposed to pancreatic lipase, and then the triglycerides are split into those free fatty acids and monoglycerides. Bile, like we said, it plays a big role in that, and um, some some of those fatty acids can be absorbed into the portal blood and not converted in triglycerides. What else? Also, you see that fat is um, um, not all of it is absorbed. Some of it just goes into the stool, and that's where you see the steatorrhea, and that's when you see fatty stools. You're gonna see that in your patient with gluten intolerance. Um, Protein digestion also begins in the stomach. You know, remember when pepsinogen was broken into pepsin with the hydrochloric acid? So when you eat a meal, the chief cell secretes pepsinogen, and then the parietal cell secretes the hydrochloric acid, and then pepsinogen, uh, um, the pepsin acts on the protein, break them down into start breaking them down. But the pancreatic enzymes, the trypsin, the chymotrypsin, and the others start also continuing the digestion of the protein. Um, then when the amino acids are produced, they're absorbed, um, and um, they're used to similar to glucose, the end product of the carbohydrates. The amino acid and the glucose are used and are moved actually in an active transport. But some also they go with some diffusion if they do not require um, um, active transport. The digestion and absorption of foods take place mainly in the small intestine. That's something you need to remember. Digestion requires hydrolysis, enzyme cleavage, fat emulsification, proteins, carbohydrates. Everything we eat in our food are broken down into smaller molecules. They're transported from the intestine into our body, and um we learned about all those enzymes that have a great factor, and some of those hormones that play a role in the digestion of all those food. And we learned about the bile and how it is. So check back, which of the following is an accurate statement regarding digestion and absorption? Is it A, B, or C? So if we remember that digestion involves movement of materials through the gastrointestinal tract at a rate that facilitates absorption, we appreciate that A is the correct answer. That is the end of our